I'm going to talk about comes out of my new project, this political history of slaves that I'm trying to write. But it's not so much about what was happening in slavery, it's about how, it's more of a reflection on how in doing this work and thinking about what slaves knew, when they knew it, how they knew it, and the purposes to what they put all that new knowledge, made me reflect differently on how we write our Reconstruction histories and to think about the ways in which these two histories bump up against each other. And that's really what I want to talk about today, because this is a conference about emancipation. So, when in July 1865, a senior Freedmen's Bureau official documented the fact-finding mission that he had made through South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida in the weeks immediately following the war, Joseph Fullerton didn't have much good to say. In a pair of lengthy reports, he rolled out a whole litany of sins. There were too few agents and too few places. He grumbled, and of those who were on duty, most had no idea what it is they were supposed to be doing. Others would soon be released from federal service. Former slaveholders, he wrote, were convinced that the national courts would declare emancipation a sham. Georgia had no assistant commissioner, neither did Florida, and outside of a handful of coastal communities, the federal presence consisted largely of a cavalry command in central Georgia at Macon and what may or may not have been a bureau official in Augusta, Georgia, and an Army officer all by himself somewhere down in West Florida. Given the evidence that Fullerton laid out, emancipation looked like it was all but stalled, except, and this is just an important little section of this report, it was stalled, by all appearances, it was stalled except in the minds of those who had been most directly affected. It appears from the general's report that the black women and men he had met held very clear and sophisticated ideas about where they would fit into a post-slavery nation, the kind of rights they would henceforth enjoy, and the roles they would play. Indeed, Fullerton wrote, there are, quote, now very few Negroes who do not know that the old system of slavery has passed away. Whenever they are asked concerning their present condition, the common reply is, we have no master now. We have come to the law now. Still, regardless of what he put down on paper, Fullerton wasn't prepared to accept that the recently freed could possibly have exited slavery in possession of a clearly articulated body of political philosophy, especially one that included an easy familiarity with legal theory and the power of law. No, he mused as he wrapped up his reports, those former slaves with whom he had talked must have appropriated their words and ideas from passing Union soldiers, or maybe they had picked them up from old masters or other ex-Confederates. Either way, it was inconceivable to the general and to many others as well that a people who had been slaves just a few weeks previously could possibly be thoughtful and informed and savvy too. Nearly a century and a half later, the majority of scholars who work in the field of Reconstruction are still really no more prepared than Joseph Fullerton to accept that black women and men could possibly have emerged from bondage as fully realized political people. Though most of us have abandoned the openly racist assumptions that metastasized in the mainstream scholarly and literary accounts that were produced in the early years of the 20th century, those ideas have less disappeared than they have simply been domesticated. Take, for instance, Toni Morrison's post-emancipation scenes in the early chapters of her highly regarded Beloved, or the timid fatalists who populate the pages of Roll Jordan Roll, of people who you really wonder how they survived outside of kind of this cloak or umbrella of a paternalist master. And these are just two examples. One can see similar sensibilities at play among scholars who continue to confuse Orlando's Patterson's idea of social death and abstraction with the reality of everyday life. And we can see it too in scholars and others who persist in defining politics in such narrow and institutional terms that the enslaved are automatically disqualified because they don't vote or they can't be elected to office. And so by extension, they can't be political people. But even if one embraces the most capacious understanding of what constitutes the political and reserves a place for the enslaved among the pantheon of historical actors, The still current practice of fracturing the American experience into what happened before the Civil War and what happened after discourages those who study post-emancipation Black life from rejecting a periodization that itself is a product of Jim Crow. Unlike our colleagues who study crashes, capitalism, and Indian wars, those of us who study Black Southerners in the 19th century still have a tendency to set our mental clocks to stop and start with the Civil War years. And any of you who are undergraduates here realize this in the way surveys are set up, right? We have U.S. history to 1865 and U.S. history since 1865. So these things are still embedded in the way we think about this very transitional moment. And we tend to specialize in one side of the divide or the other, and it's rare for any of us to do both. And it's a choice that has significant intellectual and interpretive consequences. For every time we start an investigation into Reconstruction in or after the outbreak of war, we leave the impression that whatever it is that Black people thought, did, or provoked as slaves had little to do with what they managed to make of and for themselves in freedom. Yet perhaps we should make a more concerted effort to reset those mental clocks and to expand our field of vision in order that we may more systematically and carefully include slavery as well as freedom, or slavery in our analyses of freedom. Indeed, I want to suggest that it is risky business to leave slaves as actors out. At the very least, dropping them out or shoving them aside recalls, however unintentionally, an older set of ideas that stridently declared that neither African Americans in general nor the enslaved in particular had a history worth studying. Marginalizing slaves in our freedom stories also raises the distinct possibility that we will miss and consequently misunderstand the full range of forces that shaped the post-Civil War South and, by extension, the post-Civil War nation. If we persist in examining only the part of the story, how can we know the whole story? Moreover, to treat Black Southerners as blank slates defies all logic. People cannot shuck their past the same way we erase data from our hard drives. Human memory simply doesn't work that way. As Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist, reminded us, in each one of us, in differing degrees, is contained the person we were yesterday. And because of the lingering presence of the past, and I think we heard some of this already in Heather's presentation, when 4 million Black Southerners laid down their tools and stopped being slaves, they carried along with them a kaleidoscope of expectations, ideas, interests, and aspirations, all of which provided starting points and guides for the lives they would go on to make for themselves in freedom. So to overlook, discredit, downplay, homogenize, all that Black Southerners accumulated, learned, heard, conveyed, exchanged, gossiped about, talked about as slaves, not only raises the possibility that we badly misread and misrepresent their struggles for freedom, it adds a new layer of insult to the injuries already done to a population whose lives and labor had in very literal and very violent ways underwritten the growth of the nation. But what I've found is truly rather, I don't know, amusing, more like ironic, I guess would be more appropriate, is that slaveholders knew what many of us still find hard to accept, that the enslaved were a formidable and deeply and well-informed political force. Now, to be sure, most masters and mistresses were pretty coy about admitting too openly that they had a rather big and fierce tiger by its tail. An admission of that nature would have been especially counterproductive in an age of aggressive abolitionism, playing right into the hands of slavery's external enemies. Nevertheless, as I have burrowed deeper and deeper into Planter's records, it's clear that there was no doubt that who slaveholders judged to be their chief opponent. Take, for instance, the increasingly draconian measures enacted by Southern lawmakers in the wake of Vesey's supposed and Turner's actual rebellions. Laws that quarantined Black sailors, evicted slaves from regional print shops, and banned the education of slaves as well as any unsupervised congregations. These were laws that were meant to insulate Black workers not only from outside agitators, but also from one another. Attempts to silence, to isolate, to put these people in little quiet boxes. Just as suggestive is the language slaveholders used to describe the slaves who gave them the most grief. Abjuring the dismissive and dehumanizing idioms of childhood or livestock, aggrieved planters routinely decried their more troublesome property in words normally reserved for political opponents, berating those who frightened them most as secret agents, traitors, subversives, saboteurs, rebels, representatives, and ringleaders. And it was not necessarily by chance that Mary Chesnut mockingly likened her husband's valet to a famous, if fictional, international spy. Lawrence, Chesnut wrote of the man in her diary, was a, quote, copper-colored Count Fosco among us. She read European literature. William Capers, who toward the end of the 1850s was an overseer for the Manigault family on one of the Savannah River plantations, just as emphatically underscored the political potential of the slaves when he announced rather bitterly about those under his that those under his supervision were nothing but, quote, a set of tackies, language that linked the Teamsters, who he found especially problematic, to the 18th century Jamaican, who has been credited by a number of scholars for launching an age of Atlantic rebellion, drawing these lines between this property and slaves and very powerful political actors. But it was a Georgia planter, Richard Lyon, who may have made the point best. Slaves, he grumbled in a letter to the governor, were a fully realized political people, individuals who not only possessed their own well-developed ideas, aspirations, and ambitions, but who also enjoyed the institutional, intellectual, and collective means to achieve them. To ignore that reality was simply suicidal, Lyon explained in a sharply worded response to a military call for laborers to build Savannah's early wartime defenses. Assembled by necessity from across the state and formed into large crews of erstwhile strangers, such congregations, Lyons cried, would afford the state's opportunities, quote, an opportunity to talk to one another of their wants and their wishes and their situations. Their minds will be inflamed, he went on, by the vicious with false and mischievous notions. Plans would be concocted and agreed upon by which the whole of the Negroes in the state would act in concert for good or evil. And when the work is done, each fellow will go back home thoroughly instructed and charged with mischief. I don't know, it sounds like Congress, doesn't it? Determined that his audience wouldn't miss the most salient point, Lyon closed by describing what for him was the most terrible of consequences, that those crews of impressed enslaved laborers constituted nothing less than, as he put it, a regular convention in which all the Negroes in the state will be ably and fully represented. I'm thinking we should pay more attention to this. And slaves did. For in another one of those ironies that we associate with Southern history, America's masters and mistresses couldn't afford to keep their slaves too far apart for too long. Well, I got ahead of myself there for a minute, sorry about that. They couldn't not bring them together. To do so would strangle their golden goose. They needed all those slaves at work. They needed them on the roads. They needed them on the go. And as a result, they needed them in and out of each other's company. Slaves were, after all, the lifeblood, the infrastructure, if you will, of an extraordinarily profitable system. To stop them in their tracks would also be to stop slavery's economy. And that was the dilemma that slaveholders faced. I mean, they couldn't have one without the other. Slaves were, in a sense, this very big, painful Achilles heel. The system that fattened their pockets and rewarded them with a heady stew of social and political prestige depended on the presence of a liquid and limber labor force. Thus, regulations such as those infamous pass laws didn't work to pin America's slaves into place on one plantation or another. They only regulated, and then unevenly and incompletely, what was a master and market mandated mobility. So instead, what we're beginning to recognize is that enslaved people, again, I think as Heather was also pointing to, lived endlessly peripatetic lives. They followed free migrants southward and westward. They traipsed along on coffle lines. They hauled crops often very long distances to market. They laid mile after mile of railroad line. They wandered as crews through pine forests making turpentine. And some went much, much further, following their owners on journeys to places as far away as Boston, Philadelphia, Liverpool, Paris, New York, and then would return with their masters back to their homes in the slaveholding states. And that, I think, was the crux of what Lyon, Capers, and Chestnut understood intuitively as a political problem. For as people, not property, enslaved women and men steadfastly refused to check their eyes, their ears, and their minds when they were out and about on a master or mistress's businesses. They didn't go about like this. They went about very attentively. Thus, for them, work had a pedagogical dimension, and it was in doing their owner's business that America's slaves came to acquire the kind of knowledge that Fullerton would later dismiss. Those intellectual, ideological, and political insights that they could later draw upon as they struggled to remake themselves into a free people. The didactic opportunities that were embedded then in antebellum labor routines were, and this is where I got sidetracked, not lost on the nation's slaves. They understood these opportunities. Work, as Henry Box Brown tells us in his narrative of slavery, functioned as a slave schoolroom. For instance, in carrying his owner's grain to a distant mill, Henry, along with his brother, came to acquire, as he later explained, quote, some little knowledge of what was going on around us. And the Brown boys weren't out of the ordinary. They were not an exception to any larger rule. Slaves, it turns out, were eager consumers of knowledge. Some took their lessons riding along with ferrying northerners from one place to another. We see this when we read Frederick Law Olmsted's accounts of his journeys throughout the southern states, of slaves sitting, enslaved teamsters sitting on the wagon with him, driving him along, but also at the same time interrogating him about world and national and regional events. Slaves learned as they followed their gold-hungry masters to the western slope of the Sierras, where work there embedded them into very multicultural, polyglot communities that one slaveholding 49er described as heterogeneous comminglements of all the people of the civilized and uncivilized world. And he goes along and lists them, Dutchmen and Germans and Italian and on and on. Still others took their lessons while biding their time in the dank and crowded interiors of slaveholders' jails, sites that in the turbulent years of a more modern civil rights movement would give rise, or civil rights struggle would give rise to a Black Power movement. But sites that in slavery jostled enslaved and free inmates together in these very kind of politically potent ways, where you could sit for days in jail, maybe with abolitionists or with free people of color who had been picked up on the lam, who could talk to one another about what they had seen, maybe as railroad workers in Virginia, or in one case that I discovered in Natchez, about being a maritime sailor in the Caribbean and Atlantic. Houston Hartsfield Hollowell, of his name, who was a slave in Upson County, Georgia, picked up his information from the side of the road. He was worked with his master's horses, deliberately scanning the shoulders for abandoned scraps of newspapers, pamphlets, broadsides, whatever he could pick up and carry home to share with his friends and relatives, in which they used to stay abreast of the news of the day, monitoring, as Holloway later recounted, the quote, the Democrats, the Whigs, the nullifiers, the abolitionists, and what I can only hope he wrote tongue-in-cheek, the anti-know-nothing party. Slaves who were hired out by their owners were perhaps the best positioned to develop a deep understanding about the world in which they lived, and we could talk about that if you need to. Particularly those whose work introduced them into the large crews that built the South's railroads, dug its minerals, tapped its pines, and processed tobacco in Richmond's factories. But while employment in large-scale extractive and industrial enterprises were especially likely to introduce enslaved or form enslaved workers into those politically ripe congregations of the kind that so frightened Richard Lyon, no slave, not even those most closely bound to a single location, existed in any kind of a social, geographic, or political vacuum. Take, for instance, all those teamsters, boatmen, and drovers who were detailed to haul the harvest to market, or the ladies' maids, valets, and nurses who accompanied their owners to northern and foreign destinations. None of these activities were done blindly, and they all brought the enslaved into contact with new faces, new geographies, new possibilities, ideas and experience that they could later be shared with others over a campfire or in the quiet of a plantation cabin. In fact, a man named John Brown, who didn't really do a lot of traveling himself, looked forward for this very reason to the arrival of enslaved strangers on his master's plantation, recalling how he, quote, treasured up in his mind any reports they brought from abroad. Brown considered new hands, the people who came to stay, people who had been bought and so would be around for more extended conversations, the best in this respect. But even the most itinerative visitors could prove useful, imparting what they knew about other people and other places before they had to part ways. A slave named Clark certainly did when in 1856 he stopped by a neighbor's plantation in northern Mississippi to update the slaves on abolitionist intentions against slavery, the marksmanship skills of, quote, those northern boys who, according to him, could outshoot those southern boys, and the wave of disease that fortuitously kept several local politicians from attending a recent Democratic convention. None of this, of course, as you can imagine, went over well with the slave's owner, who promptly registered a belated complaint with Clark's master, but the damage, if you were a slaveholder, had already been done. Now, it's true that the years leading up to Abraham Lincoln's election stand out for an absence of large-scale slave revolts. But as historians, we should always be cautious about taking our evidence at face value. An absence of unrest is no more evidence of ignorance than it is of quiescence. And as avid students of the world around them, America's slaves spent those years leveraging masters' and mistresses' demands on their time into a vast and expanding body of geographic, social, and political knowledge. It was a cache of ideas and experiences that some used to make their way out of slavery permanently and early, decisions that exasperated already fraught sectional tensions. Others turned what they had heard and learned into personal shields, using their understanding of the law or abolitionists or places like Haiti to help deflect some of slavery's worst oppressions. Most probably imprudently kept their ideas, beliefs, and grasp of political realities tucked away out of sight. But what is highly unlikely is that any of them simply forgot, erasing from their minds and memories all that they had seen, all who they had met, all of the things they had heard while doing their work as slaves. Those ideas, experiences, and memories, they retained. A body of thought that was profoundly personal, profoundly political, and which constituted the starting point for struggles in freedom. So in closing, I want to suggest that in our attempt to unravel the complicated snarl that is Black Reconstruction, that we should make it a habit to ask sharper and more specific detail about the lives Black women and men conducted in bondage. And perhaps in expanding our studies backwards in time, we might discover important links between the aspirations and accomplishments of freedom and what people had done, seen, heard, and learned as slaves. Or maybe we'll discover that there were no connections, and that these intellectual and philosophical threads that had been developed and discussed over campfires and bondage had been ruptured irreparably by war. But point in fact is we don't know if we don't make it a practice to ask. So thank you.